Now, in this video, we're going to be taking a relatively quick look, or as quick as we can considering he's been in 8 movies now, at the journey of Tony Stark, or Iron Man, from his very first movie entitled, well, just Iron Man, which also was the movie that kicked off the MCU, all the way up to where we find him at the end of Infinity War, and going into Endgame. And when we do first meet Tony Stark, he's a man who plays completely by his own rules, always gets what he wants when he wants it, and has no rivals or equals of any kind on any level. He's absolutely brilliant and will happily tell you about it. He also avoids responsibility at all costs, despite arguably being one of the most important and influential people in the entire world. And he's willingly oblivious to what his legacy, or his family's legacy, may have wrought over the years, since his fortune has been amassed from building weapons. Nor does he care about accolades or what others think about him, for good or bad. He skips out on an award ceremony for him as easily as he brushes off being called such things as the Merchant of Death, and the most famous mass murderer in the history of America. In fact, he has canned responses to these accusations against him, showing that this is something he's long since gotten tired of hearing about, and just doesn't care to think about it anymore. There's also a great remark of his, very early in the movie when he's taking a picture with a soldier, who flashes a peace sign, when he jokingly remarks that, yeah, he loves peace, and that he'd be out of a job with peace. But ironically enough, and just mere moments after saying that, while riding in a convoy after a weapons presentation in Afghanistan, his entire life and very being is literally and figuratively blown to hell, and he'll soon be forced to come face to face with the consequences of turning a blind eye to everything in his life and letting others do everything for him, as he learns the weapons his company builds have fallen into the hands of the proverbial bad guys, and that those same bad guys have taken him prisoner and want him to make them a Jericho missile, which is the newest Stark Industries weapon that he'd been there to show off. And perhaps even the greater irony here for Tony Stark is the only way to save his life after being taken prisoner, because they want him to do what he does best, which is build a weapon, is to do what he does best and build the ultimate weapon, but not for his captors, but rather for himself to use to escape. And along with the help of a fellow captive Jensen, Tony Stark builds the Mark I Iron Man suit and uses it to escape, and is soon rescued and brought home, where responsibility instantly goes from something he's always ignored to a burden he places entirely and squarely upon his own shoulders, as he immediately announces plans for his company to cease weapon production. While behind the scenes, he begins work on another Iron Man suit, a much more advanced version than the crude one he could make in some cave, so that he and he alone can use it to begin to right the wrongs of his company, many of which are indeed his fault. And in true Tony Stark fashion, as soon as his new suit is complete and a few test runs are over, and with little thought really given to possible ramifications and complications, he puts it and himself right into action after learning more of his company's weapons have fallen into the wrong hands. Though when he confronts Obadiah Stone about it, who is his business partner, he learns they've been selling to both sides all along, and Tony truly begins to understand what his irresponsibility has brought about. And in the end, Tony personally deals with Stone, who has created a suit of his own and become Ironmonger. And so in this first movie, Tony goes from being an extremely arrogant and irresponsible man who only seemingly cares about drinking, womanizing, and living life how he wants to live it and by his own rules, to still being extremely arrogant and full of himself, which gets highlighted when he just can't resist telling the press he's Iron Man. However, he's also now someone who desperately wants to become a better person and right his own wrongs, and thinks he can and should do it all by himself, which is very much the issue at the center of the next movie he's in, which is of course Iron Man 2, where we find Tony Stark, or Iron Man, several months after the events of the first movie, and he has, or so he claims, essentially helped bring about a world peace, but is now embroiled in controversy because the government sees the suit as a weapon that should be turned over to them, not kept in the hands of a private citizen. Though mainly they want to get their hands on the suit to be able to, of course, make more of them in the name of security, because they fear other nations are close to duplicating this technology, now that Stark has let the genie out of the bottle, if you will. But during a Senate hearing, Tony quite clearly and comically shows that no other country is even close to creating anything like Iron Man, and even embarrasses Hammer Industries, Stark Industries' main yet distant rival. And although many consider this to be nowhere near as good as the first Iron Man movie, there are a few interesting dynamics at play here. Because while Tony Stark is trying to keep Iron Man all to himself, he's actually, unknown to anyone else, dying because of the arc reactor in his chest that is being fueled by palladium and is slowly poisoning him. So while in some respects he's trying to push away his friends, perhaps to make his death easier on them, in all reality he needs them now more than ever, and not just to pick up his slack for being irresponsible, but because he has more responsibility than ever now, and he needs to pass it on. Mainly his company, with which he makes Pepper the new CEO, and his Iron Man suits, one of which he lets his best friend Rhodey, quote-unquote, steal. And then it promptly gets turned over to Hammer, who goes to Ivan Vanko, the son of an old partner of Howard Stark, who was of course Tony's father, and Ivan is looking for revenge on the Starks in his father's name, because he never got the credit and recognition he deserved for all his contributions. And while Ivan is seeking that for his father, Tony unexpectedly gets both help and reconciliation with his father from beyond the grave, when Tony discovers a message for him in an old video, one that helps him create a new element to power the reactor in his chest, one that's even more powerful and won't poison him, and he also learns that his father always considered Tony his greatest creation. And in the end here, Tony finally begins to learn to start to trust people, at least to some degree, with this burden of immense responsibility he's taken upon himself. And this is difficult for him for three main reasons. First, he of course loves being the center of attention and doesn't want to share it. Second, he really does believe in himself and his intelligence and abilities that damn much, and thinks he himself can fix everything. And third, again, the blame for what his company did, which we saw in the first movie, really weighs heavily upon him, and he feels it's his responsibility and his alone to right those wrongs. Nevertheless, together with Rhodey, or War Machine, they beat Ivan Vanko, or Whiplash, and destroy all the drones he'd created. However, when we see Tony Stark again, that being in the first of the Avengers movies, we see his ego, quite literally, on display and immortalized in the form of Stark Tower. And it's that very ego that he must tackle and finally overcome in this movie. He has to learn to be a small part of something far greater than himself, for the sake of, quite literally, saving the entire planet. But even harder for him still is that he has to let someone else take the helm and be the one who leads him, that of course being Captain America. But at first, he doesn't see the use of this relic of the past that his father used to talk of so highly all of the time. They even verbally spar a bit, and Cap essentially tells Tony he's nothing without the suit, and asks what he would be if it was taken away. To which Tony responds with that famous line of his about being a genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. And Cap tells him he's known plenty of guys with none of that worth 10 of him, and that he's not the type to lay down his life for the other guy, that Tony always will think there's going to be a way out. And before their confrontation can come to blows, though to be clear, their aggression towards each other was being spurred on by the power of Loki's staff, which contains the Mind Stone that was, well, messing with their minds as Loki wanted it to. Anyway, before they can go a few rounds, as Cap suggested, the helicarrier they're on is attacked, and they have to go from about to rip each other's heads off to joining together for really the first time. And though they technically win this battle, it comes at the cost of the life of Agent Coulson, and it takes this death for Tony Stark to really begin to understand the stakes here, that this isn't just some game that's all about him being the hero and saving the day, that if they continue to stand divided, they could very easily lose, and them losing means the world itself losing. So when the time comes, Tony finally sets aside all his pride and his ego, and not only defers to Captain America to make the call about how to defend New York City, but is willing to make the ultimate sacrifice by flying the nuke that'll otherwise blow up the city through the wormhole to take out their enemies. And this is the moment when, at long last, Tony Stark finally becomes a true hero, one who is not doing this for the fame or the glory, or to right his own wrongs or to ease his own conscience, but because it's what is required of him and what he must do for the greater good. But it's this selfless act and the attack on New York City itself that has Tony suffering PTSD when we next see him, this time in Iron Man 3. And in this movie, they kind of went back to his roots a bit and reaffirmed the character, if you will, and try to answer that question posed by Captain America in the Avengers about what is he without the suit? And the answer is, well, the same guy who got himself out of that cave alive in the first Iron Man movie. And though at face value, there doesn't seem to be a lot of character progression in this movie, and there was also a wasted opportunity to turn the Mandarin into Iron Man's greatest enemy to date, this does end up being a bit of a turning point in the life of Tony Stark. Because the one thing that truly gets established in this movie is he finally seems willing to put his love for Pepper to the forefront, and to make it a priority in his life, one that'll take precedence over all else. Because yeah, he does eventually want other things out of life. which he tries to prove by blowing up all of his suits. However, at the very end of the movie, when he poses the question to himself, "Who am I?" he says that famous line that ended the first movie, "I am Iron Man." And then when we pick up with him again in Avengers Age of Ultron, he's just back to having suits and working with the Avengers without any sort of real explanation. Though I suppose we can infer easily enough that Stark feels some level of guilt about wanting to actually live his life and eventually leave the team and leave the fate of the world in the hands of others, which is why he's even created an Iron Legion, which are more or less automated Iron Man suits, or drones if you will. And it's all part of Tony's plan to create some type of ultimate global defense program that he calls Ultron. In other words, he's now thinking and looking at the big picture and seeking long-term solutions about how to keep Earth safe, since really the Avengers can't or shouldn't be expected to do it forever. Eventually, something needs to replace them. Also, thanks to Scarlet Witch, Tony has been given a glimpse of a future where the Avengers utterly fail, and all of this leads him to take the stone from the recently recovered Loki's scepter, which is of course the Mind Stone, and he uses it to create an AI to power or run his global defense program. But of course this AI, Ultron, that Stark has created to protect life on Earth, comes to the conclusion that humans are the problem and will need to be eradicated. The rest of the movie is then spent dealing with this threat, and there are some interesting themes that never get fully explored about how Tony seems stunned that he could create something as evil as Ultron, while Ultron seems confused or angered by the fact that he has some of Tony Stark's personality and arrogance within him. Nevertheless, what this movie also does is begin to form the rift between Iron Man and Captain America. Because Cap isn't all on board with Iron Man's line of thinking here, not after all he's gone through with Project Insight in the movie Winter Soldier, where S.H.I.E.L.D., secretly being controlled by Hydra, wanted to do something very similar by deploying helicarriers that would theoretically stop threats before they actually became threats. And so the foundation for the upcoming Civil War is very much laid in this movie. And if I may quickly note here, this is of course the sheer brilliance of the MCU. They've taken two radically different characters and set them down very similar paths that run virtually parallel to each other, with them intersecting at many different points and becoming friends, only to then have them come out the other side of this journey with the exact opposite conclusions or beliefs. And then they set these two ideologies against each other and pit hero against hero in a movie where neither side is really wrong. And when the movie ends, we have no real winner. There's only defeat for both sides. And that is both the beauty and sadness of Civil War, a movie that starts out with Tony Stark having to see the face of a young man who died due to his actions in Sokovia, even though those actions were in a successful effort to save the entire world. And this is where the story of Iron Man comes full circle. This is where the man who started out avoiding responsibility at all cost, only to take on as much as he possibly could once he learned the price of his ignorance, now wants to shift that responsibility elsewhere onto someone or something else because he's finally realized there's no way to always win. There's no way to always make the right choice where no one gets hurt and everyone gets saved. Even the greatest and most well-meaning of heroes will end up with blood on their hands from time to time. And when he realizes all of this, he is completely in favor and signs the Sokovia Accords, which will essentially turn the Avengers into a police force that the world can use when and where they're deemed needed, forever taking the burden of blame off of his shoulders, or so he believes. Though again, after all Cap has been through, he cannot foresee turning the power to wield the Avengers over to anyone else. He believes that the safest hands will always be their own. Captain America will take potentially having blood on his hands or dealing with possible guilt, failure, or regret if it means he's always staying true to himself and his beliefs and has always done what he feels is right. And soon enough then, a battle breaks out between the Avengers, with some siding with Cap and others with Iron Man. And in this battle, Tony's best friend Rhodey is severely injured. And perhaps it's here that Tony begins to understand that there's no way to truly free himself from the burden of blame and responsibility. And he begins to see Cap's side of things and why he's so willing to do everything he can for his best friend Bucky. Tony then learns that Zemo has been behind absolutely everything, that Bucky is indeed innocent, or at least innocent when it comes to the bombing in Vienna, which has set these current events into motion. And so he goes to Siberia to make peace with Cap and Bucky, and to help them stop Zemo from waking up even more of these super soldiers. But when he gets there, the super soldiers are already dead, and the carefully laid trap of Zemo's is finally sprung, as Tony is shown a tape of Bucky murdering his parents. And of course, the irony is completely lost on Tony at this point, that Winter Soldier, or Bucky, has just done what he was ordered to do, or actually brainwashed to do, and in a sense was not responsible for his actions when he killed Tony's parents. The same way Tony doesn't want to be responsible for his actions any longer, which is why he was so quick to sign the Sokovia Accords and hand over the control of the Avengers to a greater authority. But again, Tony, blinded by rage, just can't see that. He only sees betrayal, and a fight ensues between them that leaves the three mentally and physically battered and beaten, and the heart of the Avengers shattered. When we see Tony again, it's now in Spider-Man Homecoming, where he's taken on a new and different type of responsibility, one that the man from that first Iron Man movie could have never handled, and even the one from the start of Civil War may have initially balked at, as he's become a mentor and type of guardian to Peter Parker, who is of course Spider-Man. And one of the main reasons he's doing this is because he's the one who's gotten Peter into this mix in the first place during Civil War, and gave him a taste of the big leagues, if you will, and he realizes he's pretty much responsible for what happens to him now. And because of that, he wants young Peter to take a step back and become more of a street-level hero, or friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, rather than the Earth-saving Avenger kind of hero right away, even though that's what Peter wants to be. And to help hold him back, Tony has given Peter a suit laden with safeguards that Peter will eventually get around. And there's a great moment in this movie after Peter gets in way over his head and needs to be bailed out by Iron Man, that Tony takes away the suit, and Peter replies that he's nothing without it, to which Tony says back, if you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it, which is a great callback to Captain America once asking him what he is without his suit, and it shows just how far Tony Stark has come, because he now realizes it is the person that you are that makes you a hero, not the suit or powers you might have. This all then takes us into Infinity War, where at the start of the movie, we see Tony Stark talking about having a baby with Pepper, as well as his upcoming marriage to her, which again reiterates for us how far he's come and how much he's changed. Soon enough, though, Doctor Strange shows up, along with Bruce Banner, and he's told about the impending attack on Earth by Thanos, who seeks the Infinity Stones there. And this is when he's forced to put to words the falling out between him and Captain America, after Banner asks him why he doesn't just call him, and Tony seems almost embarrassed when he hears himself have to talk about it. And we soon learn that, even when going out for a morning jog with Pepper, that Tony takes the phone given to him by Captain America, likely absolutely everywhere he goes, as it's in his pocket that very morning. But he still hesitates to make the call, even when Earth is facing a great threat, which is exactly why Cap is given it to him in the first place. Once again, ego and pride are Tony Stark's greatest enemies. Soon enough then, Tony's having to apologize to Pepper yet again, this time for literally flying off to save the day, even though it's becoming very evident all he really wants is a simple, or relatively simple for him, life with her, but there's obviously no way he can't get involved in all of this. And so he finds himself in outer space with the last two people from Earth he'd like to be there with, those being Doctor Strange, a fellow egotistical alpha male, and one who uses magic of all things, and Peter Parker, the kid he's responsible for, and mentoring in the hopes of turning him into a better version of himself one day, to take his place when he finally steps out of the Iron Man suit for the last time. But of course, in the end, Tony and those with him fail to get the gauntlet from Thanos, and the Mad Titan ultimately snaps his fingers and wipes out half of all life in the universe. And among those lost is Peter Parker, who Tony watches turn to dust in his arms. Which brings us to the endgame for Tony Stark. And I think the big question here is, does he get the happy ending with Pepper, or does he give his life for the greater good? In truth, both would make for a fitting end for this character and his story. One way or the other, though, I think we'll get to see a reunion between him and Captain America. I think that's obvious. One where he gives him back the shield, and they'll fight side by side once more, and for the fate of, well, everything. And even though we know somehow, some way the Avengers will ultimately win in the end, we have to ask the same question young Gamora asked of Thanos at the end of Infinity War. What did it cost you? And for the Avengers, it may very well be the same answer. Everything. Well, that's all I've got for this time. If you made it this far and enjoyed the video, I also did one of these for Captain America that I'll include a link to in the description below. And next week, hopefully on Monday, I'll have one up for Thor. Either way, let me know what you thought of the video or what you think Tony Stark's fate will be in Endgame. and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.